Well, good afternoon. Delight to be with you once again for our daily studies. This week, we're studying a great leadership law that I'm very excited about to share on, and that is the law of intuition. And we're looking at Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, and how he applied the law of intuition. So we're on day 2. And so we'll just jump right in because we got a lot of ground to cover today. Jethro's story in the Bible is found, really is confined to one chapter, chapter 18 of the book of Exodus. And so everything that we are sharing this week will flow out of that one chapter. Now, in regard to the law of intuition, here's where we're going. Intuitive leaders can sense what's happening among people and almost instantly know their fears, their hopes, and their concerns. And so we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into this issue. There we go. We're going to take a little deeper dive into this issue. I'm overcoming a technical issue right at the moment. There we go. Okay, first, of course, our leadership thought for today. It's a little interesting because when you hear it, you'll immediately come to a certain understanding of what that means, but it doesn't really mean what you think it means. And what I'm saying is that intuitive leaders are readers. But here we're not talking about reading books and magazines and articles specifically. That's all good, and certainly we should do that. But we're really looking at reading in a different kind of way. And so first, let's talk about this issue of intuition. So according to Webster's New Universal Unabridged Dictionary, here's the definition of intuition: the direct perception of truth, fact, etc., independent of any reasoning process, immediate apprehension, or a keen and quick insight. And so it's not that we completely lay thinking aside, but the thinking occurs so rapidly that you can't really identify the process of coming to a conclusion. It's when you say, I know that I know that I know. I don't know how I know, I just know. That's what we mean by intuition. So you just know without prior study or experimentation. A great analogy for understanding intuition is reading. Intuitive leaders are readers, but here we're not necessarily talking about books. Jethro illustrates for us the kind of reading that we have in mind today. So we're going to look at 5 different ways in which Jethro demonstrates that he was a reading leader. So when we think about how he counseled Moses, we find that Jethro was a reader of these 5 different situations. Well, situation is actually the first one. But he read the situation, he read the trends, he read the resources, he read the people, and maybe most importantly, he read himself. And so let's talk about these 5 issues here: situations, trends, resources, people, and himself. So Jethro was able to size up the situation as it related to Moses. I mean, when you go through that text, he just immediately knew what Moses should do. But again, we point out that he had no experience whatsoever with anybody there but Moses, his daughter, and his grandkids. Never had seen any of the 1 million people who were there. And so he couldn't have been a consultant in that sense from having studied and prepared himself, but yet he had this intuitive sense of knowing what to do. So he asked Moses, "Why do you alone sit, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening?" And then he shared with Moses, "The thing that you do is not good." So Jethro didn't have to bring in consultants or create a study committee or do research to determine what to do. But he instantly recognized that Moses had a leadership problem and that it was going to get much worse if he didn't do something about it. And so that kind of leads us then to the trends, because a trend is really talking about today, but in relation to tomorrow and to the future. And so intuitive leaders not only see what's going on in the present, but they also see where the organization is headed in the future if changes aren't made. So Jethro knew that Moses was running into trouble and doing it really, really quickly if he didn't change his leadership style. Even if Moses were doing a good job now, he would not be able to sustain it. That point there is so interesting in the one sense, in that things can actually be going well today, but leading to disaster tomorrow if we're not able to have an intuitive person who can see that and read that for us. That's why intuitive leaders are so important, because they can see things that maybe the rest of us who aren't quite as gifted in intuition, we can't see them like they can. And they can tell us, they can share with us, hey, the direction you're headed, even though it's working today, may or may not work tomorrow. And so those people are very valuable. And so listen to what Jethro then says to Moses. He says, "Both you and the people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. For this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself." So he understood that both Moses and the people would suffer, and therefore the whole nation would suffer if something wasn't done. Third, then, is resources. Intuitive leaders know how to resource the vision. So in other words, it's great to have a vision, but if you don't have any resources to carry it out, you're kind of stuck with just a pipe dream. A dream without any resources is a pipe dream. And so Jethro then suggested how they could maximize the assets they had on hand. So what were the assets that the people had? Basically, three significant assets came into play here. The first is God's favor. We know that God's favor was on Moses and it was on the children of Israel. He had just miraculously gotten them out of Egypt and into the desert and miraculously provided for them. We know all that story. And so God's favor, and it's listed here first for a very good reason, because that's the most important asset that one could have, God's favor. But then there was the heart of Moses, who truly loved the people. In fact, on two occasions throughout Moses' life, God threatened to annihilate the entire nation of Israel except for Moses, and basically create a whole nother nation with Moses as like the progenitor. And both times, Moses got on his face before God and said, "Don't do it. Don't do that." And so that demonstrates Moses' heart both for God, but perhaps more importantly from a leadership standpoint, his heart for the people. And then finally, God's favor being the most important resource, Moses' heart as the leader, but it's the people themselves. They were their own asset. And so Jethro was able to maximize the value of all these assets. Now, how did he do that? Well, first he proposed that Moses seek God's counsel. Get God's perspective on things before you move ahead. That's a good thing for us to follow. That's a good principle in any situation. Then second, Jethro said, you should then teach the people God's laws, his ways, what he wants done, who he wants you to become, In other words, pour your heart out to the people. And then finally, he said, you need to empower the people to share the burden of decision making. That was the crux of the problem, or that's what the proximate issue was, that Moses was about to burn himself out and the people. And so the people themselves then would provide the resource to deal with that issue. And so we see here then that there was 3 significant assets that the people had available to them, and Jethro's intuitive nature enabled them to maximize all 3. And so that's an important contribution. So now let's talk about the people then. Intuitive leaders tend to excel when it comes to people and people skills, because they just know where people are coming from. It's like they have this advanced insight. It's like if you were being told a secret about somebody and then you went up and asked them about that particular issue. Well, you already knew it because someone told you. That's kind of what intuition is. You know something about people and how to motivate them and how to encourage them and how to lead them. So Jethro knew that Moses would actually accomplish more by doing less. Boy, talk about a very practical, but yet sometimes hard to really think it through, how we can actually accomplish more by doing less. In Moses' case, that was exactly the point, that he had to do less of what he was doing, have the people start doing more of what they needed to be doing, so that Moses could focus on that which only he could do. And that was exactly what Jethro said. He said, handle only the cases, the difficult ones that they can't handle, but entrust everything else to the other leaders. So Jethro also understood that leadership appointment process had to be driven by ability and not position. Oh, how important that is. Sometimes people can strive for a position that may or may not align with their skill set. That ends up being a disaster for everybody involved, including the person in that position, where it's a misfit. That is why he suggested that some leaders be placed over, and maybe you caught that in the word, but he said, place some leaders over thousands, some over hundreds, some over 50s, and some over 10s. So there was that sense of not everyone has the same ability. So don't put someone whose ability can lead 10 and put them over 1,000. That's not going to work. But by aligning people's skills with the job you give them, things go much better. A researcher by the name of Jim Collins wrote a book called Good to Great. Amazing, amazing book. And he uses an analogy in that book of getting the wrong people off the bus, the right people on the bus, and then finally, and maybe a key step, is to put the people in the right seats on the bus. In other words, if the organization is going to go forward, then you need people doing the jobs that they were created to do, that they're skilled to do. That's what he meant by the right seats on the right bus. Sometimes we can think that someone needs to be off the bus when in fact they just need to be repositioned. Their heart and their attitude says, yeah, they should be on the bus, but if they're in the wrong job, the tendency could be, well, we ought to get them off the bus. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the best thing is just to change seats, and they'll be much more productive, much more happy. Lastly, all intuitive leaders can read all of the external factors that we've just talked about. But there's one that's not, one factor that's not external at all, and that is, in Jethro's case, himself, ourselves. Intuitive leaders read themselves. They not only know their strengths, their growth opportunities, but they also know their calling. So consider Jethro here. He had this sense of knowing exactly what Moses ought to do. But what we don't find here, and really kind of amazing, is, you know, there's no hint that he ever said, Moses, why don't you step aside and let me be in charge, because I obviously know what needs to be done. To him, it came so naturally what the answer was. But here's the issue that brings this point to light. Jethro knew that Moses was the one God called to lead the children of Israel. It wasn't Jethro, but Moses. So Jethro, in this situation, he could have done one of three things. He could have been an obstacle. He could have tried to usurp Moses' position. Other people throughout Israel's history tried to do that very thing, tried to usurp his position. Or in a more passive-aggressive kind of way, he could have opted to undermine Moses' leadership, but instead he empowered it. Wouldn't you like to have someone like Jethro in your corner? Because Jethro could have done damage. If his heart wasn't in the right place, he could have severely either usurped or certainly undermined Moses' place of leadership. But Jethro knew this wasn't my gig. It's Moses. And because he obviously cared for Moses and wanted to see the blessing of God extend, he empowered Moses instead of getting in his way. And I have this sense, although it doesn't quite specifically say, but I really believe that when Jethro had this conversation with Moses, that he did it privately, that he didn't do it out in front of everybody where Moses might have felt minimized or marginalized. But there's the sense when he refers to these people in this conversation with Moses that maybe he had pulled him aside afterward and where he just had this one-on-one time with Moses where he could really speak into his life. That's the value of having some intuitive leaders close to you. So, moving along here. Look at any leader whose intuition is sharp, and you will see an ability to read a leadership situation. We've already covered a couple of these examples already. Nehemiah, when he built the wall in Jerusalem, he just knew what needed to be done. When Joseph was told Pharaoh's dreams, when Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams, he immediately knew what was going to happen, and he knew how to deal with the situation in advance. He said there's going to be 7 good years, then there's going to be 7 bad years, and so we need to store during the 7 good years in order to be prepared for the 7 bad ones. There's that intuition. So, in conclusion then, intuition, whether it's natural or has been developed intentionally, helps a good leader to become a great one. And so as we head toward our touchdown, I'm going to ask today's question for reflection. I'm going to pose it in 2 different ways. It really is getting at the same thing, but it's just said differently. So you can address it either way you want to. But here it is. Here's kind of part 1. Do others see leadership issues before you? Now, if you're more of a glass half full kind of person, then I'll turn it around to basically ask the same thing. Do you see leadership issues before others do? Because that's what we're talking about with intuition. So think about that. Think about those on your leadership team perhaps and ask yourself, do I see things first or do they? Now, it doesn't mean something bad about you if you would say others kind of do, but maybe you might get some insights from them if that's the case. But just think about that question. Review your history, maybe even the past few years, if you want current information, and ask yourself, do others see leadership issues before I do? Or do I tend to see leadership issues before they do? That will let you know, or at least give you some sense for the level of intuition that you operate on. So with that, I've enjoyed today. I hope you have too, that you've gotten something out of it. And we look forward to sharing more on this great law of intuition tomorrow. We'll see you at 3:30. God bless you all.